it's hard to pick a favorite out of my own books. I think I'm always most interested in the one that I'm working on right now, so it's always changing. Thing with the series, it's sort of whatever I'm working on right now is what I'm most interested in, or whatever I want to be working on next sometimes will become the thing I'm really keenest on. But the favorite characters, I think in the Tory books, my favorite character, other than Tory, is Rookfeather. Tory's my favorite character in that, definitely, but Rookfeather too. And in The Warlocks of Talverden, I think my favorite character is actually not the hero Maury, but his friend Corby, who's just so much fun to write. When I was 10 or 11, I sort of made up a bit of a story about a boy who was a foundling and who was brought up by a witch. And that character, I never really did anything with it. I think I wrote a paragraph of it. But I'd occasionally keep going back to that character, trying to think of a good plot for him. And eventually, much, much later, he turned into Maury. And one thing that, I guess, from that character that kind of lasted into Nightwalker, aside from being a foundling, was that in some of those early versions, the boy was a swineherd. And that's why I stuck the pigs into Nightwalker when Annette is rescuing Maury. There's all the pigs are just sort of a private little joke about the origin of the character. Well, the idea of a whole race of people that can just step into darkness and vanish into another dimension or another plane of existence is kind of neat, but I don't really remember where it came from. It just sort of suddenly was there and came together with that foundling boy character, and suddenly I had Maury and the Nightwalkers. It's, when I was writing, I didn't sit down and sort of work out all the details of the half-world at once. It's been evolving as I've worked on the series, which means that at this point I have to, I'm working on books 3 and 4 right now, and I have to kind of go back and look at what I've said in books 1 and 2 sometimes, just to see if I'm contradicting myself. When there's something I want to do with the half-world now, make sure I didn't say something earlier on that would mean I can't do that now. And it's, because I didn't plan it all out in advance, sometimes it can be kind of tricky to work out when I want to do something, how I'm going to do it, because, well, rain and snow and water and things like that are turning out to be kind of interesting and occasionally difficult to deal with in the half-world. And I've already said that fire is cold and harmless when you're in the half-world, but right now I'm wondering, well, what about smoke? If you run into a burning house, you're not going to be burned, but are you going to suffocate? This is something I really need to be figuring out right now for plot reasons. So I kind of make it up as I go along, but I have to be consistent with what I've done in the past. But it keeps getting more complicated and more interesting as I go along. I suppose some people do read it that way, but it wasn't meant to be what I call an about book. It's mostly an adventure story about a boy growing up and making a place for himself in the world. I suppose it just is a story about an outsider, a boy or a person who's in a terrible situation that he didn't cause, and who has no power at all or hardly any power at all to change that, and about how he deals with that and does manage to change it, or to change his situation, but also to change what caused that situation and make the world a bit better, both for himself but for the people like him that come after him. In book 3, Maury's circumstances have really changed. He has a lot of power both politically and as a warlock, but that doesn't change the fact that he's still an outsider who's not really, doesn't really belong to one kingdom or the other. He's still a person who's not quite at home and not completely accepted in either place. I sort of make the map while I'm working on the book. I tend to write books in which there's a lot of landscape, I guess you'd call it, and a lot of traveling through that landscape. So as I'm writing, I tend to start making sketch maps so that I can keep track of how far people are traveling and have an idea how long they've been traveling, so that it's sort of realistic how long it's taking them to get from one place to another. So I make these sketch maps in my notebooks and start writing distances on them and that kind of thing. And then as the book goes along, the map becomes more detailed. And then once it's done, I tend to finally do a good copy for the publishers. In some books, of course, the map already exists. Like for Nightwalker, I did a map of the island of Eswiland, and that means that for most of the action in Treason, I didn't need to go back and make a new map because all the distances were already there, and I had to make the story fit the map that already existed. But then I had to draw the continent as well and sort of expand the world, the detailed measurements and things in the world for other elements of that book. In the map for Tori and the Snake Prince, there are a lot of places on that map you'll notice that aren't mentioned in the book, and that's because that map is actually a map both for Tori and the Snake Prince and for another unpublished Tori book. And so I was putting in a lot of the detail of the Kingdom of Erythroth for that other story, so that the map would work for both books. Tolkien is probably the main influence. I think I read Tolkien very intensely when I was young, and that really shaped my love of language. He is the master of the English language, really, for his sort of complete immersion in the subtlety and the strength of English. And I think from reading Tolkien that intensely, I really picked up an instinct for the rhythms of English and for the potential power of it. When it comes to writing for children and teens, I think Lloyd Alexander and Rosemary Sutcliffe are people who've had a big influence on how I approach telling the story. I think it has, because well, a lot of the books that I was writing about were books that I'd loved as a kid, but going back and reading them, not only as an adult, because a lot of them were books I go back and reread anyway, but reading them with a sort of a more critical academic eye, it really made me pay attention to what the authors were doing and how the authors were doing what they were doing. And of course also in doing the research for those books, I ended up discovering a lot of authors that I hadn't read before. And that was, very valuable, I think, for my own writing, and that it did expose me to a lot of books I hadn't read before, and a lot of writing styles I hadn't necessarily encountered before. Trying to make a living. Writing.